Thank you very much for the invitation. Having us here is good, and we really much appreciate the opportunity to share some, let's say, conceptual ideas of something which is very much work in progress, you can say. So we would like to share these ideas and hopefully have a lively discussion in the end with you on what we are planning to do. So, contested constructions of wildlife in Namibian conservation practices, a conceptual framework, that is what we would like to present. And this is the structure of what we are going to present. So after not really short, but a bit broader introduction into the topic, we will give you some ideas of this conceptual framework of wildlife, which we are going to employ. Then there will be some background information on what we call our political ecology perspective on this matter. And then on the other side, and afterwards pretty much integrated, a perspective of visual geographies that we also would like to employ. And that will be the conclusion in the end, like having these two strands together and presenting a conceptual framework on Namibia's future wildlife that embraces these two perspectives.
And to start with, I would like just to present you some examples about struggles of conceptions of nature and wildlife, with one first quote from a manager of the Ministry of Environment and Tourism. And I will just read it now in German, in English for the non-German speakers of you. But you cannot compare a springbok with a rhino. If we have too many springboks in a small park, we decide what is more valuable. Should we catch them and shove them into another park? Say these other parks also have too many. Should we shoot them? Should we sell them alive? How much does it cost to catch them alive and sell them? You need to consider and then to make a decision. And I think one of the key words here is value. And here you have a struggle between different values for conservation, the value of the animals for conservation, and the value in monetary terms. There's a cost-benefit analysis done here. How much does it cost to shoot them? How much does it cost to catch them and to put them in another park? So there are struggles here in one person. But of course, you can very well imagine that inside the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, there are different strands. There are people who are really looking more at the costs and people who are more in favor of nature conservation for the interest of conservation. Another example, I don't know if you came across this story 2 or 3 years ago, where a wealthy American citizen bought by an auction at the Dallas Safari Club the right to shoot a black rhino. A black rhino is quite rare, and there were only 2 put in auction that year in the Palmberg concession, and there was of course an upheaval, especially from in the US, for shooting this individual animal. And here there were a campaign from opponents who wanted to pressurize the US Fish and Wildlife Service to deny to import the trophy and making then the shooting worthless for this Mr. Knowlton. And here there's also a reminiscences on this collage. Africans go to jail for poaching. White men go home with a trophy. And here there's also a legacy which is part of this struggle between the different interests confronted in conservation debates. Now I will continue with the importance of media and images in this conservation approaches and the struggles over conservation. And here we are taking a quote from Daniel Brockington from the University of Manchester, who is emphasizing the importance of the media and the images. And here, I think what is important to remember is that what we could call the spectacle of nature, and he is here mobilizing authors like Baudrillard and Guy Debord, is fast becoming one of the important ways in which capitalism and conservation are interacting and even cooperating. And I think for a long time, at least in my youth, there was a kind of antagonism between capitalism on one side and nature conservation on the other side, saying, okay, capitalism is destroying nature, is destroying our environment, and now we are now part of a discourse where both are not at all opponents anymore, but are somehow completely imbricated. And one question is, of course, how and why? With what logic? So what we intend to do is to understand this multidimensional interplay of practices of different actors who are stakeholders in this conservation debate, and these practices which are decisive for the conservation and then of what kind of nature, what kind of wildlife. Then, of course, it also includes the imaginations which are at play here. And I think everyone has some pictures, some imaginaries in mind when talking about nature, wildlife, and nature conservation. And of course, what we intend to do is to excavate these imageries of nature conservation in order to understand the practices which are following these imageries. So our focus is at the interface between, on one side, political ecology of nature conservation, on the other side, the visual geography, in order to understand these decision-making processes which are producing this what kind of nature or what kind of wildlife. So I think most of you are very familiar with political ecology, so I don't want to repeat and read everything here on the slide. What I think is the most important aspect here is that the relationships of power, which are inherent to processes of economic transformations, are also a result of this capitalist relations of production on one side. And then I think in German we have a very nice concept of Vergesellschaftung, which also goes back to Marx, meaning the appropriation of nature is depending on a dialectical relationship between, on one side, the conception and the transformation of nature. On one side, the ideas we have of nature and the use we have and we are making out of nature.
So as it comes to the visual geography perspective on it, we can say that these struggles upon Namibia's future wildlife are very much affected by what we can name the visual imaginary and its effect. And we think that visual geography in this respect provides a very good opportunity for reflecting on this interrelation of mental as well as material images that come together in these discursive as well as discourses as well as views that we have if you normally look at landscape and how we imagine landscape and how we imagine it should be and what should be part of it and what not. So this is a very basic approach of the visual geography side. And on the other hand, we would like to position us a little bit in the recent discourse on non-representational and representational theory. And we think that this kind of approach is, of course, in a way representational as we work with images, with pictures, material images, mental images, and how they have an effect. But on the other hand, it is also non-representational representational, and so far as this supposed representational, we think has an effect, and we critically reflect on this effect and how it is always dividing, for example, between something that is natural and something that is non-natural, the human and the non-human, and so on. We will proceed on that later on. So this will also give us a good chance to look closer at the power relation within this field and also the power of images and how they work. On the other hand, we will also take into account the effective immediate effect of visuality and its somatic power. So this is also a non-representational aspect of what we are planning to do and of what visual geography can serve with. So there is something that can get you very physically if you look at a picture, and which can not only be grasped if you see it as a representational act. And as we will see later on, these images might, theoretically spoken, also have an effect on what we do and how wildlife in itself is being materialized by what we think it should be. And the final point of the opportunities of a visual geography approach is that we can also critically deal with the historicity and the discursivity of images and inherent interpretive power structures. And on this point, we will also proceed later on. Additionally, or maybe also as against the background of what we presented so far, we can also say that what we would like to do is a post-colonial and social nature perspective. Post-colonial, as it is presupposing and critically questioning dominant colonial, Eurocentric or Western imaginations of wildlife. And what is important is that this is not dedicated to specific subjects. So it can be, it's never like black and white. It's never precise persons that are carrying the one perspective or the other. And finally, it's also social nature in the way that we are presupposing the social construction of nature, but without reducing the natural to its social construction. So as I said, there is more than that, and we will try to grasp like agency on the one hand, agency even of animals, and on the other hand also the visual somatic power of what is depicted as, for example, wildlife. As a continuation of our positionality in the theoretic debate and discourses, we would also like to stress that we are not going to adopt without any critical reflection what, for example, Lorimer claims to be a new ontology of wildlife, because we don't think that it is so easy just to claim that these dualisms of nature and culture, the material, the non-material, and so forth, can be easily overcome. They cannot easily be overcome, especially not by claiming it to be like that, because they are everyday made and reproduced. And this is why we think it's much more worthwhile to employ what we call a epistemological anthropocentrism. So we very much position ourselves as being anthropocentric. and that we are not able to get out of this position easily. So what we think is interesting then is to follow the dualisms, not to claim them to be overcome, but to see how they are employed in everyday life, in discourses and the imaginary of wildlife and nature. And on the other hand, then we have also a possibility to look at their realities, because they are real in a way that they are made, and their shifts. So our concept of wildlife and its other, so it's also a dualism, is wildlife for us is the product of a process in which representational and material practices as well as non-human agency are entangled. So this is the field. And that it is temporarily and territorially defined and fixed by humans, that it is made stable and static and essential in everyday language, in everyday visualization, in everyday practice. But on the other hand, ontologically spoken, we outgo from that it is dynamic and variable by nature. Then we have the chance to look at the material and physical resonances and resistances that are included in this process. So we have this construction of nature, we have this construction of wildlife, and construction of what is in and what is out, and of exclusions and inclusions. But on the other hand, we also suspect the material, at least the material, are like the animals, to be resonant, that there are resistances, that it's not easy to just construct it like that, and then it is like that. So we will see this later on in some examples. And finally, we also suspect that there is something like a visual encounter that also has like a blending of physical, material, and representational effects. One example for this is the charisma of animals that makes a difference if you do some kind of construction of who should be loved, who should be in, who should be part of our future nature, who should be part of our future wildlife. Then it makes a difference if you have a lion or like a Kellerasel, something creepy or not very charismatic. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I wanted to present you, even the slides is not excellent, but there's a debate going on in park research, trying to understand the different periods of park and establishment of parks and the purpose of these parks. And one very famous article from Mays, a biologist, published in Science, differentiated among 3 or 4 different periods of the establishment of parks. I don't want to go too much into details, but the first generation parks, the one of, for example, of Yellowstone or the Swiss National Park, that were created nature for itself. It was really a biological, natural, naturist approach. Then there was nature despite people. This is the phase where a lot of people got expelled from different parks, especially in Africa, but also in South America. And then with the beginning of the 2000s and the increasing resistance also on the global scale to the expel of these people, a new approach was implemented also thanks to donor agencies, Nature for People, with this whole debate of ecosystem services, etc. And now we have people and nature, an approach, a paradigm which is trying to emphasize the cohabitant, the possibility of coexistence of nature and people in these parks. Now, a political ecology perspective would say, okay, that's fine and nice, but what is missing here is really the political economy, which are lying behind these paradigms and the approaches. And Vaccaro and colleagues framed the concept of fortress conservation. This is what Masis is calling nature for itself, which need to be protected from any kind of influence coming from outside. That's why big fences or walls, in order to protect nature from any kind of, of influence. And what we have now with these ecosystem services and this approach, people and nature, this is what they call co-management conservation, trying really to find a consensus between different interests which are at stake, and or neoliberal conservation. And this is the whole movement of how now more and more services which were belonging to park administrations were outsourced, privatized, delegated to other NGOs or companies.
Only as a remark, though it is chronologically depicted here, Mace herself says, of course, that all of these four key ideas can be found parallel and in work today. So you have to look very closely on this, and these certain groups that are employing these one particular idea, key idea of nature conservation.
And an excellent example of this is this kind of map, where you have this national parks in dark green. This is the state-protected areas like the Etosha National Park, Namibia, Skeleton Coast Park, and then you have the concession areas, like for example Palmweg. This is C2 here in the northwestern corner, or Hobatere C4, just adjacent to the Etosha National Park. And then, of course, the whole big list of communal conservancies which spread from roughly the western part of Namibia to also other parts of Namibia. And something which also now started heavily to grow since the 90s are the freehold conservancies. These are farms, cattle farms, which were converted to game farms. Some are consolidated, meaning that farms are added one by one to create a big conservancy, freehold conservancy, which are run according to different institutions, either private companies, multinationals, or foundations. So, and here on this map you have the coexistence of different approaches of nature conservation. We have on one side still the approach of fortress conservation in these national parks. You have this neoliberal momentum in the freehold, but even in the communal conservancies, very present, and of course in the concessions. So now interesting for us is to see how do they relate to each other? Who is influencing what? What kind of concepts are taken over? What are rejected? What are the kind of relationships established of these different entities? And here perhaps just to summarize the kind of thesis you can formulate with these different approaches of nature conservation and wildlife. You have, of course, this privatization of public spaces, and I think for the ones who know Etosha National Park since many years can already observe how certain services are now outsourced, are delegated to private companies through licensing or different concessions. There's a shift from recreational purpose of national parks to commercialization. I mean, you can already compare the prices of entrance of the Etosha National Park since its beginnings to today. I mean, at the very beginning, it was a national park for whites only during the apartheid region for recreation in order to support somehow the political basis of the apartheid regime, to give them something to play with on one side. And today it's commercialized on such a level that even if it's cheaper for Namibian natives to enter, it's still a very a park which is very much dominated by white people. And then there's a shift in market orientation in the sense that because it was so cheap, because it was also part of the South African approach to nature, which was also trying to consolidate its political basis, it was designed and accessible for the middle classes, even for the lower middle classes. And now through the prices, through the possibilities, the prices of overnight stays in the parks, etc. It's more getting to become something reserved somehow for the upper class. And it is even more obvious if you are looking at the hunting sector, which is aiming at a very, very specific market segment. And be it the sport hunting, the trophy hunting, and in Namibia also starting with the canned hunting. Just to illustrate the importance of hunting, now you can download from the internet the demand for a permit for a hunting permit, and you can here, you have the free choice between a cheetah, a leopard, or a lion. And to finish with, last point is the role of protected species. Of course, once certain species have their price on the market, you can organize auctions either in Namibia or in the US. Then for the park managers, there is the question, do we breed now for the sake of conservation, for the biodiversity with the logic of biology, or do we breed for the market? And I think here already, I'm especially thinking about the Waterberg Plateau National Park, where some species are only located there, and it's not for disseminating this kind of species like the buffalo to other parks in Namibia, but it's really for the market. And here auctions are now multiplying. In Namibia, it's just something we encountered last year when we were in Namibia. You can acquire whatever you desire from a rhino to sable antelopes. There's even a beginner packages if you want really to start. But we don't enter so much in communal conservancies. There are so many research going on this topic. There's also a debate about the purpose, the logic, the rationale of these communal conservancies in relation with wildlife management. Of course, people are thinking and presenting it's again in terms of access to additional financial resources because of the tourism coming in, but it's a way out of the poverty trap. And there's, of course, starting and increasing the importance of shift from the livestock farming to game farming because it's much more gaining. Here, I don't want to go too much in the debate, but it's an interesting one in order to understand also the purpose of nature conservation in these conservancies. Of course, the conservancies, perhaps just to underline this, are not homogeneous. There are different people. The communities are quite socially differentiated, and of course, there are people there who are gaining out of this nature conservation business, and some are losing.
Yeah, one of the, I think, most interesting and important relations that we can see from a visual geography perspective is that of how we come from images to actions, how this is transferred. So how our imagination and their material implications, how can they be theorized, how can they be grasped? And we call this the perlocution of the visual and of imagination. I take this term from speech act theory, actually. And the perlocutionary acts are viewed at the level of their consequences. So how are images persuading, convincing, scaring maybe, enlightening, inspiring, or otherwise affecting the observer or the viewer? And one of the very critical terms here are expectations, because visuality can shape, or powerfully shapes expectations. For example, of how, of what we are going to see if we go there. This you can also take from the picture that we already presented. So there's advertisement on Namibia from travel agencies and so on, and they depict Namibia in a particular way and the nature of Namibia in a particular way. And this, on the other hand, then is shaping the expectations of, for example, travelers who go there and who would like to have Namibia then exactly, more or less, as they saw in the pictures. So there are both expectations of specific visual experience, and these are also invitations or motivations to go there, to travel there, which in turn also have economic effects, of course. So imaginary is a very important player in this field. And not the least, such visuality also has its effect on park management, of course. Because if park managers know what the expectations of like travelers, tourists, economic clients are, they use it, of course, as a guideline for how they, put or shift animals in their parks or not, which is referring to the quote from the park manager from the Ministry of Education and Tourism that we presented in the beginning. So, and in this respect, you really can talk about that wildlife is designed in a particular way that is visually inflected. And this visuality of wildlife, of course, has a history, and this is also something that we are going to deal with, and that we are going to want to reconstruct to understand better how these expectations and management practices today are guided by the visuality not only of today but also of the past. And this will, of course, then will last into the future, as we suspect. We outgo from transethnic colonial heritage. Why transethnic? Because, as I said in the beginning, we are not saying that that there's one imaginary that belongs to one particular ethnic group or something. So that they today also interlap, and that you can find a particular imaginary that you would maybe easily cling to a black or a traditional or autochthone idea, but it is not so. So it is really transgrading, as we suspect, such not dualism, but categories that we sometimes very easily put on that. So, would you want to say something about the black poachers and white hunters, maybe? No. Okay. And these different imaginaries can also vary if you only look at one particular animal, for instance. So this is like the elephant example. So you have a kind of imaginary or a particular construction outgoing from here the San people or the Oberhimba, and this is where, what the quote is about. For them, the Oberhimba, the elephant is accorded respect and his habits are well known. When used as an epithet for human beings, it is out of a sense of strength, wisdom, and stability. So here we have the elephant as a strong, we can say, companion of the human. And another discourse strand, there's another elephant constructed. Here the elephant is the intruder, and almost a criminal who is trespassing the borders and the fences that are aligned. And here's a third elephant coming up. Here the elephant is a status, is a symbol for not his or her strength itself, but for the strength of them who are hunting them, poaching them, whatever. So, no, hunting them in this case, yes. And here is a fourth elephant, and here the elephant is a necessary part of the inventory of national parks in Namibia and of Namibia itself. Or even, as you say, see Africa. So. And that images are important in this respect, and that they need to be managed is something that also the public discourse and even the ministry has now taken into account. So here, this is a story about a couple of lions that has been shot by Namibian peasants. Illegally, you must say, because in Namibia it's today like that you first, if you have a lion on your compound, then you must report this lion to the ministry as a problem lion. And then the ministry decides whether this lion is to be shot or not, or whatever is said to be done with it. So, and they did not do that, but shot them instantly, and then they took pictures from it, and then they posted that on Facebook. And this was a very fueled a big debate on properties, on territorially defined entitlement to wild animals, nonetheless, you can also see how this fueled the debate later on imaginaries that these people somehow destroyed, and that then led to imaginaries of Namibia without lions. That was also something that was very negatively posted. So, and this is another example of how these imaginaries visions and the apparent production of knowledge and mastery from that vision has been used to define the boundaries, not only between nature and non-nature, but also between the human and the animal. This is a quote from Bolton. And we only would like to stress with this picture that these imaginations, of course, get materialized, for example, as you see here, as fences, but also as what we can, what we call the big five, this assemble of animals that needs to be present if tourists shall be attracted, but also of wildlife sanctuaries, the imagination of harmonic wildlife, for example. Of course, a wildlife that is employed for humans, not for itself, as in the matrix, flagship species, and so on. But on the other hand, such materializations, of course, are also contested in a material way, as you see here. So the fences are trespassed, boundaries are ignored, and territories invaded. And this is what is often called then human-wildlife conflicts. If the wildlife does not behave as it is supposed to do, and as it is imagined to do.
It was so nice to listen to you. Yeah, so these are some of our foci, inspired by John Ury, who started with this tourist gaze as one of the major aspects of production of certain scapes, tourist scapes, be it in urban areas or otherwise. And here, of course, and we emphasized at the beginning, there are blatant economic interests at stake, trying to attract and to reproduce, to get hold of this tourist gaze or even consumers' gaze, and when you're talking about the hunters who are coming for consumption. And here there are then implications on what kind of species are bred, what kind of species are presented in the parks, what are the species present in these parks. Then of course there are also and still the science gaze, and if you are working in the Etosha Park, there are a whole range of zoologists and biologists who are working there and trying to understand first, of course, the habitat and the ecological system there. And they are, of course, emphasizing the importance of the biodiversity, different rare species, and the debate between the local, the endemic species and the neozoan or the invasive species. Then in these imaginations, there are also some romantic gaze, and I think here we saw already some examples of it. And I think when we are traveling, we are looking for this pristine nature, the sublime nature. And of course, this is nature without humans. And that's one reason why, for example, in the Etosha, some of the San people were expelled in order to make a proper natural park. And then, of course, there are also some statutory gaze in the sense that some animals have a certain status, a national status, but also international status. Namibia can't do, and the Ministry of Environment can't do whatever it wishes. It has also to respect some protocols of IUCN, etc. Some species are more protected than the others, which is also, of course, influencing the prioritization of the wildlife produced in certain areas. And this is also object of negotiations and power relationships inside the ministry, but also from the ministry on a global scale. What can we do? What shall we do with the ivory, for example, etc. Yeah, and this is perhaps what I already hinted at. Inside the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, there are some struggles between different services departments. There are, of course, also struggles inside conservancies, be it freehold, perhaps easier to solve, but also, and especially in communal conservancies, where some of the population are more in favor of certain species or certain approaches to wildlife management. The parliamentary debate on, for example, the shooting of the lions were also exemplary, that there are different visions, different imaginaries here at play, how to deal with the so-called human-wildlife conflicts. and literally, these imaginations or imaginaries are now not linked to skin color and are not linked to certain ethnic groups. And here in the ministry, we found in the hierarchy people with very different imaginaries or visions of nature conservation, and you can't make a correlation between these imaginations with skin color. And I think black people have now also completely internalized some white visions of wildlife, and some of the white rangers or park managers have completely distant visions of what was inherited or what they did learn when they were at the university during the apartheid time. So it's much complex about now who is standing or what kind of representations do people have. Okay, we are thinking about putting a focus on the freehold conservancies because of different reasons. But one of them is that, as this quote from Jones and Barnes is showing, that the biggest increase of wildlife happened in these freehold conservancies, especially for large mammals. And here, according to this study, 80% of the numbers of larger game mammals are found on privately owned commercial farms. And only 20% remains in either national parks or in the communal conservancies. And then we can finish.
Just as another remark, another reason for choosing this is also because we think that all these different gazes that Olivier has laid out before, that they're coming together in a very particular way and a very exemplary way in these freehold conservancies. For example, because of the tourist realm that is very much important in this respect. Yes, and to finish with, we have some questions. That's something I learned from Hans-Georg Bohle, who is also very well known in this place. That it's better to finish with good questions than with good answers. So these are a couple of our research questions that we are going to employ.
So what kind of wildlife is produced? And I think if we have a historical glance, we can see how shifts were undertaken since colonial times and how wildlife did change with colonialism, with apartheid, and now with the post-colonial era. And this means in terms of wildlife, in terms of animals present in these parks, but also the imaginations and the visual materials which were produced. And you can easily compare what was taken from photographs or paintings from the colonial times and compare them with the images, the visuality produced today.
A reconstruction which will be connected to some archive work also on these on the history of the images and the lines of development of certain images that we aim to reconstruct. And then what we said before, in particular, how do mental and material images of animals affect conservation approaches? In what way are they prioritizing certain species, but others? What is the effect on breeding? But also, what is the effect on wildlife and management practices that we can trace?
And here, especially, the emphasis is also put on fences and the importance, the dominance of fences in Namibia. And I think this is a typical heritage of the apartheid period, to solve conflicts by putting a fence, and to think that by putting a fence we will solve the conflict. That now with a fence, everybody or now everything has its right place, and as soon as you are losing now or leaving your right place, then we have a problem. And I think this is something which needs also still to be excavated, the importance of the fence in these imaginations.
The manner of putting groups, not only of people, but also animals, into their place, with a border in between. But then also, as we have mentioned, we ask for what does the wildlife do? How does the wildlife adapt, react, or even act in terms of agency? What do predators, elephants, and others do with the borders that are given to them? And how, in turn, does this affect their construction of the Namibian wildlife in the conservancies? Mm-hmm. Yours. It's mine again. So, finally, not finally, because there's more to come, of course. What are the imaginations of relevant experts, of course, or the actors on the one hand, locally involved actors on the other, such as farmers, pastoralists, and so on, but as well as children. So, and this is another strand that we would like to follow, because this stresses the idea that the future of Namibia's wildlife is not only in the hands of present adult actors, but the future is made by these actors that are now young, that are being educated in schools, and also have their particular imagination of wildlife, an imagination that is very much shaped also via the education process. So, these are some results of interviews that I was conducting in Namibian schools. Together with this picture for example, as one question, the question of do you think big cats should be protected? Why not? Another question was what do these big cats tell you about your life? What do they have to do with your life? Yeah, and here are some of the answers why they should be protected. Yes, because they are special and beautiful. So a very particular image of that will be maybe very important for future conservation practices. Another girl said or wrote, it is really sad. It is really saddening to think that the next generation will not be able to see these amazing animals. And this imagination, of course, also has its history you can propose. So, now we're at an end, and we thank you very much for the attention.